The Screaming Staircase, Chapter 5. Some people claim the problem has always been with us. Ghosts are nothing new, they say. They have always behaved the same. There's a story the Roman writer Pliny told, for instance, almost 2,000 years ago. It's about a scholar who bought a house in Athens. The house was suspiciously cheap, and he soon discovered it was haunted. On the very first night, he was visited by the specter of a gaunt old man in chains. The visitor beckoned to him. Instead of fleeing, the scholar followed the ghost out into the yard, where he saw it vanish into the earth. The next day, the scholar had his servants dig at that spot. Sure enough, they soon uncovered a mangled skeleton. The bones were properly buried, and the haunting ceased. End of story. A classic type 2 ghost, the experts say, with a classic simple purpose, the desire to right a hidden wrong. Just the same as the ghosts we endure today. So nothing's really changed. Sorry, but I don't buy it. Okay, it's a decent example of a hidden source. We've all known plenty of similar cases, but notice two things. First, the scholar in the story doesn't seem at all concerned that he might be ghost-touched and so swell up, turn blue, and die a painful death. Maybe he was just stupid, not to mention lucky. Or maybe visitors came back in ancient times weren't quite as dangerous as they are now. And they certainly weren't as common either. That's the second thing. The haunted house in the Pliny story? It's probably the only one in Athens, which is why it was so cheap. Here in modern London, there are dozens of them, with more springing up all the time, no matter what the agencies do. In those days, ghosts were fairly rare. Now we've got an epidemic. So it seems pretty obvious to me that the problem's different from what went before. Something strange and new did start happening around 50 or 60 years ago, and no one's got a damn clue why. If you look in the old newspapers, like George does all the time, you can find mentions of scattered ghostly sightings cropping up in Kent and Sussex around the middle of the last century. But it was a decade or so later that a bloody series of cases, such as the Hidgegate Terror and the Mudlane Phantom, attracted serious attention. In each instance, a sudden outbreak of supernatural phenomena was followed by a number of gruesome deaths. Conventional investigations came to nothing, and one or two policemen also died. At last, two young researchers, Tom Rotwell and Marissa Fitz, managed to trace each haunting to its respective source. In the case of the Terror, a bricked-up skull. In that of the Phantom, a highwayman's body staked out at the crossroads. Their success drew great acclaim, and for the first time, the existence of visitors was firmly imprinted on the public mind. In the years that followed, many other hauntings started to come to light, first in London and the South, and slowly spreading across the country. An atmosphere of widespread panic developed. There were riots and demonstrations. Churches and mosques did excellent business as people sought to save their souls. Soon both Fitz and Rotwell launched psychic agencies to cope with the demand, leading the way for a host of lesser rivals. Finally, the government itself took action, issuing curfews at nightfall and rolling out production of ghost lamps in major cities. None of this actually solved the problem, of course. The best that could be said was that, as time passed, the country got used to living with the new reality. Adult citizens kept their heads down, made sure their houses were well stocked with iron, and left it to the agencies to contain the supernatural threat. The agencies, in turn, sought the best operatives. And because extreme psychic sensitivity is almost exclusively found in the very young, this meant that whole generations of children, like me, found themselves becoming part of the front line. I was born Lucy Joan Carlyle in the fourth official decade of the problem, when it had already spread across the whole of our islands, and even the smallest towns had their ghost lamps and all villages had their warning bells. My father was a porter in the railway station of a little town in the north of England, a place of slate roofs roofs and stone walls set tight among green hills. He was small, red-faced, bent-backed, sinewy, and hair as an ape. His breath smelled of strong brown beer, and his hands were hard and swift in punishing any of his children who disturbed his usual taciturn indifference. If he ever called me by my name, I don't recall it, he was a distant and arbitrary force. After he fell under a train when I was 5 years old, my only real emotion was fear that we might not be done with him. In the event, the government's new untimely death regulations were followed to the letter. The priests scattered iron on the tracks where the accident occurred. They put silver coins on the corpse's eyes. They hung an iron charm around his neck to break the connection with his ghost. These precautions did the job fine. He never came back. Even if he had, my mother said, it wouldn't have caused us any problems. He'd only have haunted the local pub. By day, I went to school in a little concrete building set above the river on the outskirts of town. In the afternoon, I played in the water meadows or in the park, but I always kept an ear out for the curfew bells and was back safe in our cottage before the sun had fully gone. Once home, I helped set up the defenses. It was my job to place the lavender candles on the sills and check the hanging charms. My elder sisters lit the lights and poured fresh water in the channel that ran beneath the porch. All would then be ready for when our mother bustled in just as night was falling. My mother, think large, pink, and harassed, washed laundry at the town's 2 small hotels. What active maternal affection she possessed had largely been eroded by work and weariness, and she had little energy to spare for her brood of girls, of whom I was 7th and the last. By day, she was mostly out. After dark, she sat slumped in a haze of lavender smoke, silently watching TV. She seldom paid me any attention whatsoever, and for the most part, left me to the care of my elder sisters. My only real point of interest to her lay in how I might eventually pay my way. Everyone knew, you see, that there was talent running in my family. My mother had seen ghosts in her youth, while 2 of my sisters had sufficient sight to get jobs with the night watch in the city of Newcastle 30 miles away. None of them, however, actually been agency material. From the first, it was obvious that I was different. I had unusual sensitivity to matters relating to the problem. Once, I guess when I was 6, I was playing in the water meadows with my favorite sister Mary, who was the closest to me in age. We lost her ball among the rushes and hunted for it a long time. When we finally found it, wedged deep in the roots and sticky amber mud, the light was almost gone. We were still trailing back along the path beside the river when the bell sounded across the fields. Mary and I looked at each other. Since infancy, we had been warned that what might happen to us if we stayed out after dark. Mary began to cry. But I was a plucky little girl, small and dauntless. "Doesn't matter," I said. "It's early yet. So they'll be as weak as babes, if there are any about around here, which I doubt." "It's not just that," my sister said. "It's Mom. She'll beat me sore." "Well, she'll beat me too. I'm older than you. She'll beat me awful sore. You'll be all right, Lucy." Privately, I doubted this. Our mother washed sheets 9 hours a day, mostly by hand, and had forearms as vast as pigs' thighs. One smack from her and your bottom vibrated for a week. We hurried in a gloomy silence. All around were the reeds and the mud and the deepening grayness of dusk. Up ahead, the town lights, twinkling in the spur of the hill, were an admonishment and a beacon to us. Our spirits rose. We could see the grass steps leading up to the road. "That Mom calling?" I said suddenly. "What? Is that her calling us?" Mary listened. "I don't hear anything. Anywhere. Our house is miles off yet." Which was true enough. Besides, it didn't seem to me that the faint, thin voice I heard was coming from the town. I looked off away across the flats toward where the river, invisible, flowed brown and deep between the hills. Hard to be sure, but I thought I saw a figure standing far out among the reeds there, a dark notch, crooked as a scarecrow. As I watched it, it began to move. Not very fast, but also not too slow, taking a line that would likely intersect our path ahead of us. I found I didn't much care to meet that person, whoever it may be. I gave my sister a playful nudge. Race you home, I said. Come on, I'm getting cold. So we ran along the track, and every few yards I jumped up to take a look and see that unknown someone making the greatest endeavors to reach us, looping and limping through the reed stalks. But the long and short of it was we went faster and we got to the steps in safety. And when I looked back down from the railings, the water meadows were a monochrome of gray vastness with nothing in them as far as the riverbeds and no voice calling to us from among the reeds. Later, once my bottom had stopped tingling, I told my mother about the figure, and she told me about a local woman who had killed herself for love there back when Mam was a little girl. Penny Nolan was her name. She waded out into the reeds, laying down in the stream, and drowned herself. As you'd expect, she'd become a type 2, a needy one, and caused trouble from time to time to people coming back late from the valley. Over the years, Agent Jacobs had wasted a lot of iron out there looking for the source, but he never found it. So presumably Penny Nolan walks there still. In the end, they rerouted the path and let the field lie fallow. It's now a pretty place of wildflowers. Incidents such as this ensured that before long my talent was common knowledge in the district. My mother waited impatiently until I was 8 years old, then took me up to meet the agents in his office just off the town square. It was an excellent timing as one of his operatives had been killed in action 3 days before. Everything worked out fine. My mother got a weekly wage, I got my first job, and Agent Jacobs got his new trainee. My employer was a tall, cadaverous gentleman who had run his local operation for more than 20 years. Treated by the townsfolk with respect bordering on defense, he was nevertheless isolated from them because of his profession and so cultivated in an aura of occult mystery. He was gray-skinned, hook-nosed, and black-bearded, and wore a slightly old-fashioned jet-black suit in the manner of an undertaker. He smoked cigarettes almost constantly, kept his iron fillings loose in his jacket pockets, and seldom changed his clothes. His rapier was yellow with ectoplasm stains. As dusk fell each evening, he led his 5 or 6 child operatives on patrol around the district, responding to alarms or, if everything was quiet, checking on public places. The eldest agents, who had passed their 3rd grade tests, wore rapiers and work belts. The youngest, like me, carried only equipment bags. Still, it seemed to me a fine thing to be part of this select and important company, walking tall in our mustard-colored jackets with the great Mr. Jacobs at our head. Over the ensuing months, I learned how to mix salt and magnesium in correct proportions and how to scatter iron according to the likely power of the ghost. I became adept at packing bags and checking flashlights, filling lamps, and testing chains. I polished rapiers, I made tea and coffee, and when trucks brought new supplies up from the Sunrise Corporation in London, I sorted through the bombs and canisters and stacked them on our shelves. Jacobs soon discovered that while I saw visitors well enough, I heard them better than anyone. Before I was 9, I'd traced the whispers at the Red Barn back to the broken post that marked the outlaw's grave. In the vile incident at the Swan Hotel, I detected the soft, stealthy footsteps creeping up the passage behind us, and so saved us all from certain ghost touch. The agent rewarded me with a swift advancement. I passed my 1st and 2nd grades in double quick time, and on my 11th birthday, gained my 3rd. On that famous day, I came home with a rapier of my own, a plastic laminated official certificate, a personal copy of Fitt's Manual for Ghost Hunters, and, more to the point, as far as my mother was concerned, a greatly increased monthly salary. I was now the family's major breadwinner, earning more in my 4 nights of work per week than my mother did in 6 long days. She celebrated by buying a new dishwasher and a bigger television. In truth, however, I didn't spend much time at home. My sisters had all left, except for Mary, who was working at the local supermarket, and I never had much to say to my mother. So I spent my waking hours, which were generally nocturnal, with the other young agents of Jacob's company. I was close to them. We worked together. We had fun. We saved each other's lives a bit. Their names, if you're all interested, were Paul, Nori, Julie, Steph, and Alfie Joe. They're all dead now. I was growing into a tall girl, strong-featured, thicker set than I'd like to have, with large eyes, heavy eyebrows, and an overlong nose with sulky lips. I wasn't pretty, but my mother once said prettiness wasn't my profession. I was quick to my feet, if not especially clever with my rapier, and ambitious to do well. I followed my orders effectively and worked smoothly in a team. I had hopes of soon getting my 4th grade and so becoming a section leader, able to lead my own subgroup and make my own decisions. My existence was dangerous but fulfilling, and I'd been moderately content if it wasn't for one essential thing. It was said that as a boy, Agent Jacobs had been trained by Fitz Agency in London. Once then, clearly, he'd been hot stuff. Well, he wasn't anymore. Of course, like every adult, his senses had long ago grown dulled. Since he couldn't detect ghosts easily, he relied on the rest of us to act as his eyes and ears. This was fair enough. All supervisors were the same. Their job was to use their experience and quick wits to help guide their agents when a visitor was sighted, to coordinate the plan of attack, and where necessary, provide backup in emergencies. In my early years at the agency, Jacobs did this reasonably well, but somewhere down the line, amid all those endless hours of waiting and watching in the darkness, he began to lose his nerve. He hung back at the edge of haunted areas, reluctant to go in. His hands shook. He chain-smoked cigarettes. He shouted orders from afar. He jumped at shadows. One night, when I approached him to report, he mistook me for a visitor. In his panic, he lashed out with his rapier and took a slice out of my cap. I was saved only by the shaking of his own sword arm. The rest of us knew what he was like, of course, and none of us cared for it. But he was the one who paid our wages, and he was an important man in our little town, so we just got on with it and trusted our own judgment. And in fact, nothing very terrible happened for quite a long time, until the night at Whitburn Mill. There was a watermill halfway up the Wythe Valley that had a bad reputation. There'd been accidents, a death or two. It had been closed for years. A local lodging firm was interested in using it as a regional office, but they wanted it made safe first. They came to Jacobs and asked him to check it out, make sure there was nothing unhealthy there. We walked up the valley in the early evening and reached it shortly after dusk. It was a warm summer night, and the birds were calling in the trees. Stars shone overhead. The mill was a great dark mass, wedged among the rocks and the conifers. The stream idled down below the gravel road. The main door to the mill had been secured with a padlock. The glass in the door panel was broken. A board had been roughly fixed over the hole. We gathered outside the door and checked our equipment. Agent Jacobs, as was his habit, looked for a seat and found one on a nearby stump. He lit a cigarette. We used our talents and made our reports. I was the only one who'd gotten anything. "I can hear sobbing," I said. "It's very faint, but quite close by." "What kind of sobbing?" Jacob asked. He was watching the bats flit past overhead. "Like a child's?" Jacob nodded vaguely. He didn't look at me. "Secure the first room," he said to us, "and check again." The lock had rusted with the years and the door was stiff and warped. We pushed it open and shone our flashlights across a large and desolate foyer. It had a low ceiling and plenty of debris on the cracked linoleum tiles. There were desks and easy chairs, old notices on the walls, a smell of rotting furniture. You could hear the sound of the stream running somewhere below the floor. We went into the foyer, taking us with a drift of cigarette smoke. Agent Jacobs did not come with us. He remained sitting on his tree stump, staring at his knees. Staying close together, we used our talents once more. I got the sobbing noise again, louder this time. We turned our flashlights off and hunted about, and it wasn't long before we saw a little glowing shape crouched far off at the end of the passage that led deeper into the mill. When we switched the flashlights back on, the passageway seemed clear. I went back out to report our findings. Paul and Julie say it looks like a little kid. I can't make out the details. It's very faint, and it's not moving. Agent Jacobs tapped ash into the grass. It hasn't responded to you in any way? Not tried to approach you? No, sir. The others think it's a weak type 1, perhaps the echo of some child who worked here long ago. All right, fine. Pin it back with iron. Then you can search the spot. Yes, sir. Only, sir... What is it, Lucy? There's something about this one. I don't like it. The end of the cigarette glowed red in the darkness as Agent Jacobs drew on it briefly. As always these days, his hand shook. His tone was irritable. Don't like it? It's a child crying. Of course you don't like it. Do you hear something else? No, sir. Another voice, maybe, from a second, stronger visitor? No. It was true. I didn't hear anything dangerous. Everything about the visitation was wispy and frail, suggestive of weakness. The sound, the shape, they were barely there at all, just a typical faint shade. We could snuff it out in a trice. All the same, I distrusted it. I disliked the way it cowered so very tightly and small. What do the others say? Jacob asked. They think it's easy enough, sir. They're impatient to get on. But it just seems wrong to me. I could hear him shifting on the stump. Wind moved among the trees. I can order them to pull back, Lucy, but vague feelings are no good. I need solid reason. No, sir. I guess it's okay. I sighed, hesitated. Perhaps you could come in with me? I asked. You could give me your opinion? There was a heavy silence. Just do your job, Agent Jacobs said. The others were impatient. When I caught sight of them, they were already advancing along the passage, their rapiers up, their salt bombs ready. Not far away, the glowing form sensed the approaching iron. It quailed and shrank, flickered in and out of vision like a badly tuned TV. It began to drift off toward a corner of the passage. It's on the move, someone said. It's fading. Keep it in sight. We don't want to lose it. If the apparition's vanishing point was not observed, locating the source would be that much more laborious. There was a general rush forward. I drew my sword, hastened to catch up with the others. The shade was so faint now, it was almost gone. My apprehensions seemed suddenly absurd. Small as an infant, ever shrinking, the ghost limped forlornly around the corner, out of view. My fellow agents hurried after it. I speeded up too, even though I hadn't actually reached the turn when the vicious flare of the plasmic light ripped across the hall in front of me. There was a squeal of tortured iron and solitary burst of magnesium fire. In the brief illumination from the flare, I saw a monstrous shadow rising. The light went out. Then all the screams began. I twisted my head, looked back down the passage across the foyer toward the open door. Far off in the distant dusk, I saw the cigarette's pinprick point of red. Sir! Mr. Jacobs! Nothing. Sir, we need your help, sir! The pinprick flared as the agent took a breath. No one came. No answer came. He didn't move. The wind roared along the corridor and nearly knocked me off my feet. The walls of the mill shook. The door open, slammed shut. I cursed in the darkness. Then I drew my canister from my belt, raised my rapier high, and ran around the corner of the corridor toward the screams. At the coroner's inquest, Agent Jacobs was heavily criticized by relatives of the dead agents, and there was talk of him being sent to court, but it never came to anything. He argued that he had acted entirely in accordance with the information I had brought him about the strength of the ghost. He claimed he had not heard my cries for help, nor any other sound from inside the mill until I'd finally broken through the window on the upper floor and tumbled down the roof to safety. He had not noticed any screaming. When I gave evidence, I tried to describe the original unease I'd felt, but was forced to admit that I detected nothing concrete. The coroner, in his summoning up, remarked that it was a pity my report had not been more accurate as the visitor's power. If it had, perhaps some lives might have been saved. His verdict was death by misadventure, which is usual in such circumstances. The relatives got payouts from the Fitz Fund and little plaques remembering their children in the town square. The mill was demolished and salt strewn over the site. Jacobs returned to work soon after. It was universally expected that after a short rest to get over the incident, I would happily rejoin him. This wasn't my opinion. I waited 3 days to regain my strength. On the 4th morning, early, while my mother and sister slept, I packed my belongings into a small bag, strapped on my rapier, and left the cottage without a backward glance. An hour later, I was on the train to London. End of chapter 5.